All right, let's do this. The weekly recap for the Standup Accelerator. This is week 47, July 12th, 2026. We had 17 people down there this week. And I think we finally got our logistics worked out. The door was open at 2:53, which is amazing. Comedy clubs are kind of multi-scheduled, so it's sometimes difficult to get things standardized. But in 95-degree waiting outside the door Texas heat, it's a good idea if you can rely on it. This week we could. So that was great. We got in there and there's about, like I said, almost 20 people. In housekeeping, which is what we usually start with, where we talk about the workshop itself and making sure everybody's oriented. I talked to people about the Comedy Writers Colony open writing system, which is a thing I've set up for people to work online in separate locations, not in the workshop, to develop mostly their stand-up, but really anything. You can do shows, you can do sketches, you can work on anything in there. The idea is everybody gets their own folder. They can permission other people into that folder. There's a bunch of different files that they can use to organize their stuff. And of course, it's going to be partly, workable and partly not. That's just kind of the nature of the way that stuff works. But jump in there, join the private Facebook group for Comedy Writers Colony and Standup Accelerator, and you'll be able to get into there and start messing around and ask other people questions, because everybody asking me questions, no bueno. In the career section, David Kahn talked about the gig that he set up at Pokey Joe's this past Monday. Said he made $39 in tips. He also played music for 2 hours before the gig. But it was fun. It was fun seeing people outside of the Creek and Cave and outside of the meetings that we do at my place for the Comedy Writers Colony to get up and do sets. And there's always more energy. It's just a different vibe. So Charles Lester went up and Casey went up and a bunch of different people went up, and it was fun. I went up and did 25 minutes, mostly, I'd say half crowd work. There were two old people there who were the normies, the regular humans who were there that weren't stand-ups. And I say old because they identified themselves as old. They were both probably in their 70s, and they'd met at some kind of meetup that met at bars. I'm like, okay, dive bars specifically here in Austin. In the skills section, we jumped in and we started talking about our current emphasis is still on character development within the idea of stand-upizing your stories, which means every human being has a ton of stories that they walk around with. But turning those into stand-up is a certain thing. Also, in just generally increasing the quality of your stories is a certain thing. And so far, we've worked on plot. We worked on a basic plot, 3-act plot of some kind of cool, very interesting beginning. It gets right into it, 3 beats, and then an out that people will remember. This week, we added in behaviors to that. We also did details, like making sure you give concrete details and that there's emotions in your stories. This week, I added in behaviors, that any character that is in your story should be doing interesting things. And this is sort of a pet peeve of mine, like in screenplays and movies, when they just focus on actors having emotions. Really bugs me. I'm like, no, I'm watching this they can have emotions, and that's interesting, but they have to be doing things. Just like a childbirth scene. It's the difference for me, like between Game of Thrones and House of Dragons. House of Dragons doesn't really work for me. In the first season, they just had like 4 different childbirths, which to me, very predictable. I've seen this many times. It's going to be a woman screaming. There's going to be a baby born, or there's going to be a baby, some kind of, crisis. And every time it's the same thing. So why do it again? Your characters need to be doing interesting things. That means surprising, new, shocking, unpredictable, extreme, special skills, all these things that make them a particularly interesting person to hear about. So during the stage time for the class, which is where everybody gets to go up and do whatever they've prepared for that day, everybody was bringing in characters that they'd developed. And again, our idea is to raise the quality level. So everybody starts, somewhere in the middle, maybe below the middle, where their characters aren't interesting. They say too many boring things about them. They give unnecessary details. They haven't made this person vivid. And as we move that up, it starts to get to where it's something you can talk about, some person you can talk about in stand-up. We still aren't really there, but it was fun to watch people go up, and then the audience and the workshop tried to help them increase the quality of that character. David talked about Michael Jackson and the different sounds that he created and how that was an interesting character. And he's also talking about his voice. David has a very deep voice, so he was talking about that as a character in itself, which is a comedy, which is a bit that I've worked on with him a little bit. Lots of other things in there. Declan talked about his tall, homophobic, misogynist uncle, who's a preacher. Casey talked about John, who's the rancher in the workshop. He's a great dude, and she turned him basically into a romance novel character. I thought that was fun, which Cormac hit when we were working on it after she did that with the phrase 50 Shades of Hay, which is perfect for a language joke. That is a professional level language joke, because there's very little change between 50 Shades of Gray and 50 Shades of Hay, but it changes the entire meaning of it, and it's specific to what she's talking about with him as a rancher. So it was a really good joke. I'm always excited when pro-level punches pop up. In the debrief after we did the stage time, I went through an example from my own show, which I have a bit that starts with the line, I have a brother who's an evangelical Christian. So you get that instantly. Evangelical Christian brother. There's a lot of information in that setup. Everything from then on is a punchline or a tag or an act out or a veer or a question or an original idea. And those are kind of your building blocks for stand-up. Those are the most common things that you find in stand-up as comedy devices. And we use that to springboard over to the idea that there's a basic dual structure for creating stand-up bits. There's information work, and then there's comedy work. Information work means you have to have great information to create comedy. You just do. Like, if you really look at stand-up, it's all based on the quality of the information. That's where it starts, that you harvest. So you have to find a great source of information. That can be a person, can be online research, can be the media or the news, can be something you see in real life, but there's information to start with. Secondly, you have to take this big information that's occurring in this event or wherever you're looking at and localize it down to a specific topic within that event or character or whatever. Then you kind of speed sift through and you make it even smaller and find all the nuggets of information, the tiny pieces of information in something. Lastly, you rescue only the most powerful tiny pieces of information that you're going to be using your bit. And then you mercilessly kill off and remove every other single piece of information that's generic, uninteresting, and you do not let that get to stage. You should not ever say an uninteresting piece of information on a stand-up stage. So for mine, my brother, evangelical Christian, 3 generic topics. Now I have to drill down into it to turn it into stand-up. And one of the things I say next, kind of a bridge line, is, and he sends me links to inspirational websites to try to convert me. And so I send him links to hardcore internet porn to try to convert him. We will see whose God is stronger. So right there, 3 punches right off the setup, and I've gotten everything out of the bit that doesn't need to be in there. So the comedy work, again, is those 6 moves. Punchline, which means you've applied a comedy mechanism to that piece of information. Tags, act outs, veers, questions, and then original ideas and thoughts. So if I'm writing a monologue script, a stand-up script to take on stage, every time there's a tiny piece of information that pops up into the world, I make sure I try to use comedy technique on it or get rid of it. If it's not interesting or stimulating enough for people to hear and do comedy about, then get it out of the script. Then second, like if I'm doing crowd work, same thing. I need personal information as specific as possible about somebody in the audience, and then I can apply the comedy mechanisms to it. Somebody asked for an example for this. Pat asked for an example, and so since he asked for the example, I used him as the example. And I hit him with 10 plus punches about how small his mustache is. And again, I don't like to do negative crowd work, and that wasn't negative. I tend to keep it positive, even if I'm teasing people. Try to celebrate them about whatever I pick. But you can do negative with it too. It doesn't matter. The important part is you get a very interesting piece of information, very small and specific, and then you start doing comedy mechanisms on it. Finally, I summarized all this by talking about how in my one-person shows, like in my stand-up, have basically evolved into one-person shows, one-person stand-up shows. And by that, I mean I like to take information that I find really stimulating and interesting and marry it up with comedy mechanisms and see how long I can keep it going. So I find really these cool topics that I like, that I think people know a little bit about, but there's a lot more that they haven't learned. And I think that's really an interesting place to start. So I've done this for the Titanic, which has all sorts of crazy trivia and outcomes behind it. Hitler, Napoleon, there are a lot of characters like that we know a little bit about them in America, but not enough to really know all the oddness that's going on behind them. So I grabbed super interesting tiny pieces of information and trivia within those topics, turn it into comedy, and try to keep that going for 75 minutes on that particular sub area, that particular topic area, which I think is fun. I think it's more fun than doing straight stand-up. I like extended bits, and I like information, especially juicy information. And finally, in the pedagogy time, where we try to explain or try to talk about how do you take all this that we just did and make it useful to yourself, there's intellectual understanding, and a lot of times people can get this stuff. They can track it. Some of the sub concepts will be like, I need to know more about that. Can give me examples. I don't really understand it yet. But most people can intellectually grab on to comedy writing techniques and stand-up techniques. The problem is, and the big challenge is getting it to soak down into your creative neurology so that neurologically your brain will start doing these things for you just instinctually without you having to turn it on specifically. And I've done this for so long, my brain definitely will do comedy creation, at the snap of a finger. I have to stop it from doing it in real life because most people in real life don't always enjoy constant comedy coming at them. But you have to practice the information and comedy techniques. You have to force them down into your practiced, subconscious, unconscious skill set so that your brain will just do it and do it really fast. That's the other thing about when you're doing crowd work, you don't have time. Crowd work is extremely fast creation. And if you slow it down, people aren't impressed by it. It doesn't work. So your brain has to do it fast. So build that into your brain, do thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of practice runs until your brain will do it on its own. Finally, next week, the assignment is, again, bring in a character. We want highly developed characters. I want them to explode on stage when you talk about them. I want nothing but laughter for the minute or 3 minutes or whatever that you're going to get to talk. And you do that by only the most interesting information about them, presented instantly. Stand-up is fast and dense. There's no lead up. There's no boring information, that you can wait for the big reveal. And attach stand-up comedy techniques to every little tiny pieces of information that you give us. The theme here is nothing boring. Try again. Nothing boring allowed on stage at all in stand-up. That's what we're going for. All right, so that's it for the week. We will see you again next week on the Stand-Up Accelerator. Come on down. It's always fun. You never know who's going to show up. We had 2 Grants this week, 2 new people who showed up, and they're both named Grant, which tags into Stu, who calls himself Big Stu, who's been around the workshop since the beginning. Apparently, there's another Big Stu in town. So he's now got to battle it out with another guy who calls himself Big Stu. Very funny and interesting. Community is always evolving out there. We'll see you next time.